let's go ahead and start. I think some people will keep coming in, but let's go ahead and start. I'm just going to make this really, really short. So our lecturer today is Jesús Vassallo. I've been trying for a number of years to get Jesús to come. Actually, I've been trying for a number of years to meet Jesús because I occasionally teach this course on architectural photography, and I'm super, you can't hear it. You could probably hear me better without the microphone. Actually, is it on? It's on.
I feel like, can you hear me pretty well?
Actually, generally speaking, the problem is always me. So that's a useful. Now, I've been trying to meet Jesús for a number of years because of architectural photography, which I'm super interested in, and which cyclically is an interest in architectural culture. The last big interest, and it was about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a whole flurry of books, kind of coffee table books that were published about architectural photography, and they were all actually really kind of mind-bendingly dull. I mean, they were dull in the sense that there were nice images, but they were really all about what was in the picture, right, and how the picture was framed, which isn't a particularly interesting discourse. I mean, that discourse has been hacked to death over the course of 100 years. And quietly on the side, Jesús published these two utterly remarkable books about architectural photography. I think they're the two best books about architectural photography in the last 25 years, but they actually look at, and I recommend them highly to you, they actually, instead of looking at architectural photography so much from the point of view of images, they look at architectural photography from the point of view of the relationship of the practices of architecture and architectural photography, especially in the era of the rise of images as the kind of primary mechanism by which we understand and translate architecture. They're super, super interesting, and particularly the one that covers the first of the two books that came out, but the one that covers how recent architects have collaborated in quite interesting ways with photographers. Particularly useful because the photographers are all trained in image theory, which the architects are not, generally speaking. And so the discourse is actually often fraught. My favorite example from that book is this really famous photograph, and I'm spacing the name of the photographer, for the Ricola building by Thomas Struth, where they approached Struth to do the photograph, and he wrote them back saying, well, I'll do it, but I'm not going to take the photographs. And you're going to let me do whatever I want. I will send someone to take the photographs, and then I will assemble that in my office, and then that will be the photograph. For which most photographers, most architects in America would be like salt on snail, but there wisely were like, totally, absolutely. And that's that remarkable photograph of the long length of the Ricola building, which you can't actually see at all. You can't get that view. So I was interested in Jesús for that reason, but then increasingly what is super fascinating about Jesús's work is, if you look on his website, or if you go and look at the Rice website, is that he's attacking this kind of broad problem of architecture on all these different fronts. And it's, to me, like one of the most interesting young faculty members out there. So I just was super desperate to make a connection between you and the school. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you, to Jesús Vassallo, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. I'm really happy to be here, really honored. And it is true that we just met today, David and I, but I feel like I've been supported in the distance by David since I first moved to Rice almost 12 years ago now, and started writing about photography. So it's really beautiful to be able to make a deeper connection in person, and to be able to be here at the school to share my work. So thank you very much to all of you for making it possible that I come today. The title of the lecture is called Broad Spectrum, and I'll explain a little bit more about that through the lecture. But basically, it's a term I'm starting to use now to try to describe how ideas that I deal with in the writing and the teaching translate to practice. So, as David said, my PhD dissertation and the first couple of books that I wrote were primarily about architecture photography, but I got there through really like a deeper concern deeper concern, I would say, with the idea of realism in architecture. So this book is titled Epics in the Everyday, Photography, Architecture, and the Problem of Realism. Why is realism a problem for architecture? It's for many reasons that I will explain. I think the primary one is that I feel like the discipline of architecture is somehow caught in a strange dichotomy. It's been caught in a dichotomy for quite some time, where we have come to understand that the idea of the avant-garde and the idea of realism are incompatible. And this presents a lot of problem because of the nature of architecture and the nature of, our practice being, putting out buildings in the world. It just makes it very hard for us to manage what we do at a conceptual level. If you think that if you are an avant-garde, you're going to have to give up on friction with the real world, for instance, the economy, society, etc. And that, on the other hand, if you engage those things, that you're going to be somehow just practicing, but not without a real opportunity to make work that is progressive in other ways. And so, one thing that I like to think is that for the very early moderns, this was not the case at all. That problem didn't exist. It's a made-up problem. So this is an image, a photograph taken by Eric Mendelssohn in the 1920s when he first came to America, did a trip through the country, and started, felt fascinated by American silos, factories, etc. I'm sure you've seen images similar to these in Le Corbusier, Gropius, etc. For that generation, I feel like there was no such distinction. Like an image like this is very clearly avant-garde photography for the 1920s standards, but it's also an act of realism in the sense that this is an architect who had been trained before modernism in the Beaux-Arts, in the styles, in ornament, and arrives at a thing like this in the middle of nowhere and feels a compulsion to photograph it and incorporate it into his own thinking. So it's for the early moderns, I think, confronting things like industry was an act. On the one hand, they're seeing the potential here of these abstract shapes to influence their composition, and somehow there's something about the abstraction of the language that is appealing, but they're also, some of the very few of their contemporaries who would confront something like this in the real world, be interested by it, try to incorporate it in their own thinking, try to explain it to other people, etc. So they were both, in my mind, avant-garde and realist at the same time. Now, after the war, that changes, right? And there's like this dichotomy starts to emerge where modernism becomes something that is very style and that is more, and that starts to behave more in a vacuum, right? And that has to do with also the evolution of abstract art and a number of art historical developments. But what I was interested in was how, as a young architect and researcher, I thought that I could somehow almost write a parallel or secondary or alternative history of modernism where almost every decade you could find architects that were trying to remain both avant-garde and realist at the same time. And all of these architects that were in this sort of legacy or this sort of lineage were for some reason completely fascinated and obsessed with photography in a very particular way, which is that they engaged in collaboration with artists. Artists working with photography as a medium and working with the built environment as a subject. And so basically what a lot of that writing about photography and architecture does is write these stories of these two lineages of photographers and architects influencing each other. So immediately after World War II, these are images taken by Nigel Henderson in the East End of London with turning his camera towards something that was not a topic for artists at the time, which is the daily life of the working class, but also a very strong, I would say, interaction and interdependence between the built environment and the life of the people. And that in turn became, I would say, the core influence for Alison and Peter Smithson, who practiced who started their practice precisely at this point in time. And I think it's really impossible to understand the work of the Smithsons without Henderson. I think the the blurring of life and art that became their hallmark, this idea of thinking of buildings not so much as objects, but as environments where things happen, of thinking of buildings almost as interfaces that enhance our attention to the world. I don't think any of that could have happened without how influenced they were by the photography of Nigel Henderson. Or maybe 10 years later, someone like Ed Ruscha in the West Coast, in LA, doing these surveys of commercial architecture, things like gas stations or these photographs of commercial fronts in Sunset Boulevard, that, again, things that nobody who would respect themselves in the art world, in the culture world, was even contemplating as a legitimate subject. It takes this type of artist, and it takes photography somehow as a first degree of apprehension to put it into cultural discourse, and then architects immediately follow suit by somehow using photography as a sort of middle ground by which they can absorb these new built realities and try to incorporate them into their own thinking and their own work. So in the case of Ed Ruscha, I think his interest in commercial architecture was a very direct influence on Venturi and Scott Brown. I don't think you can understand the emphasis on superficiality, this idea that you can make compositions with cheap buildings, that buildings can be shallow, that buildings can be, not grand and still interesting, that there can be an allowance for contradiction, and that architecture can have an aesthetic voice without aiming for, classicism, etc. So again, I think there is this process by which photographers act as Sherpas for the architects. They somehow get out into the world, and out of the infinity of subjects in the world, they are able to not only locate the ones that are perhaps more culturally relevant, but also devise a visual language that allows the architects to then start to appropriate this work and start to really incorporate it. So to make an architecture that is perhaps closer to the reality of the built environment as a way to be more empathetic and I would say more relevant that way as well. So 10 years later, this is a photograph by Louis Baltz of, this is from the new industrial parks, also in California, but it could be any photograph by the new topographics generation. It could be any photograph by the Düsseldorf School of Photography, where they basically find these buildings which are really not the work of an architect. They're almost like the byproduct of late capitalism and post-industrial economy, and again, things that are not considered to be legitimate cultural objects, yet they develop a visual language. In this case, it has to do with the precision of the framing, the frontality, the flatness, etc., that allows then architects to somehow imagine that this is a legitimate subject matter, legitimate mode of production. And so, for instance, I don't think it's possible to understand the early work of Herzog and de Meuron and their acceptance of the box as a format for almost the entirety of their production. During 15 years, they only did boxes. I don't think you can get to that early Herzog and de Meuron work that we admire so much without the influence of the Düsseldorf School of Design, without the influence of people like the new topographics. So I'm going decade by decade, as you can see, very quickly, because I want to get to my own work as well. But this is 10 years later, early 2000s, Thomas Demand with his paper model of anonymous places and architecture, and a very direct and engaged collaboration with Caruso and St. John architects in the UK, who somehow have a very similar approach to, I would say, to maybe an architecture that can be more anonymous, but also that where architects can find or sort of apply their craft to a series of motifs and a series of subjects and a series of smaller, minor, I would say, minor architectures that perhaps were not sort of in the center of attention. This work is happening in the eclosion of the star system, with Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas winning competitions all over the globe. And there's these younger architects that are instead looking at this crazy German artist who's doing paper models and decide to do something more modest somehow because through the work of Thomas de Man, they can see how their craft can legitimize these more humble things that and have and produce an architecture that has a more direct relationship to everyday life in a way as well. So, and now the last one, already practically in our time, this is maybe 6, 7 years old. This is a photograph by Philippe Dujardin, who is a Belgian photographer, who now already in the digital age produces a lot of his work actually happens in post-production in Photoshop. So this is not a photograph; it's a splicing of many photographs where he's basically capturing the vernacular architecture of his city, of Ghent, of the outskirts of his city, and then producing these images that are almost like where he just takes these bits and pieces that are already chaotic in their actual state and just compresses more and more of them into the frame to basically make this idea of the built environment as somehow a work of art that happens through collisions in time through many hands, all of them anonymous, clashing with each other, and how that can be a legitimate way to think about architecture. And then that sort of approach, which starts with photography and images, is then picked up by architects contemporaries of ours, such as Jan de Belder, who in his own work applies a lot of these digital collage techniques in a very direct way in his own work, and all of his buildings can be perceived and understood as a collision of fragments of very ordinary things that become extraordinary through the way that they clash and sort of make difference together. So that's more or less a sort of super brief, absurdly brief summary of some of the photographers and architects that I've written about. But I bring it up to explain a little bit where this interest in realism comes, but also to explain that in my own biography, writing comes before practice. And so I practiced for many years for other architects when I was still in Spain. I'm originally from Madrid. And then I became a professor and I wrote for many years. And then at one point I wanted to go back to practice, and I found myself with this problem, which is now I have to do something that I've been writing about for a very long time. I'm the realism guy, and everybody's going to be not that anybody's looking at what I do, but if somebody were looking, right now I'm the realism guy, and let's see what he does. And so of course there's no upside in that situation because you have a lot to lose and very little to win. So I had to come up with basically how do you apply these ideas to practice. And what's interesting is that realism is a problem partially because it sort of it claims it has a claim on aesthetic issues and it has a claim on ethical issues, right? And I think through the writing on photography and architecture, I managed to dissect a lot of the aesthetic part, right? Meaning that because of the format of a dissertation, I ended up writing a narrative and an argument that was an art historical argument that was mostly about aesthetics, right? And so in moving into practice, my question was, how do I meaningfully translate this into an ethics for my own practice without emulating any of these people that I admire so much, right? So in order to do that, I somehow had to go back into why I originally became concerned with this problem of realism and what was somehow the original ethical concern that I had. And so I use this is not an image that I love, it's an image that I hate, but it's very useful for me to make the point about what I mean when I talk about realism. So this is the type of architecture that was happening when I was an architecture student. Again, the eclosion of the star system. This is a complex in the city of Valencia in Spain by architect Santiago Calatrava. It's a series of monuments, museums, and civic buildings with very, very blurry, I would say, undefined program that was hugely expensive and that was intended to emulate what Frank Gehry had done for the city of Bilbao with the Guggenheim Museum. Right? This is a point in time, early 2000s, where every single city wants to have this iconic building by a A-list architect, because that's going to rebrand the city and it's going to transform it. But in the end, what you get in this image is a very jarring dichotomy between the white building in the front that is occupying 90% of the image, and then what you can see in the corner to the right, which is the housing where the actual people in Valencia live, right? And so I just became really concerned that architects were not only, at least in principle, that we were being taught that that's what architects do. Architects do 1% of the buildings, which are the buildings that matter. And that also correlated in many ways with a class problem, right? The architects work also for 1% of the clients, right? And the money and the creativity and the resources are placed in that 1%, and then you get 99% of the construction, the housing, the people, which are being recipient of a much smaller amount of effort, but also just in a way a certain sadness that architects would somehow relinquish agency over 99% of the product. So for instance, when I studied in Spain, you would say that the Calatrava was architecture and that the housing on the backdrop was construction. We wouldn't even call it architecture in a way. So this is, and at that point is when I thought of this idea of broad spectrum architecture. So maybe instead of putting all our efforts into this one white building, we could maybe put our efforts in a more, even if it's in a more diluted way, we should probably reorient our efforts to try to have, even if it's a small impact on the 99% of the built environment, that would be more valuable. And I'm making this is a polemic argument. I'm not a Jacobin. So I've tried different ways to do that. Just to maybe as a sort of how do you get to that point, right? Or how do you get to make a point about that in your own practice? So I've tried different things. I think construction materials are very interesting. I think construction itself is a very interesting thing for us to, if we forget for a second that we are designers and we just think that we are people who somehow dictate how construction happens. I think construction, if you put enough imagination into it, can be sublimated into architecture and into art. Construction materials are also very interesting. I don't think we really talk enough about them at the schools of architecture. They're interesting at many levels. They're linked to the economy. They're linked to people's sort of cultural apprehension of buildings, etc. Housing is another. Obviously in the previous image, 90% of the built environment is housing, so we should talk more about housing. And then, at least in the European context, I would say in America as well, another way to somehow get to this idea of having a broader impact is to work with existing buildings. So what you would call adaptive reuse in the US, right? And that's so in a very coarse way, trying to feel my way into an ethics for my own practice. Those are the three topics that I've mostly focused on. So this is one of the first projects that I did as I was trying to start my practice and going back to design. I did it with friends and colleagues of a young office from Valencia called Reyam. So there's very few years between this image and this image. This is the economic boom, the housing bubble of the early mid-2000s. This is 2009, burst of the housing bubble, economic crisis. Countries especially in the south of Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece, were hit the hardest. Spain particularly had a really bad housing bubble problem. So you go, from construction everywhere, money flowing everywhere, to everything stopped. Banks are foreclosing on properties. They get all these unfinished developments that they don't know what to do. And so for a competition, we came up with this idea that perhaps, there was a way to think intelligently about this. Banks really had no interest or no knowledge of what to do with these things. So we thought maybe, there's something interesting that could be done by pairing these abandoned developments with all the architects that have lost their jobs. So at that point, both my partners in this project and myself had to emigrate. Were living already outside of the country, 2012, 2013. So we just called other friends who we knew had to emigrate to Latin America, the US, Mexico, Europe, Asia, etc. And we came up with this polemic project where we sent a friend of ours who is a photographer to document one of these abandoned developments, which you can see in these images, and then we assigned each of these ruins to each of our offices, right? So I'm making an argument that there could be a way to somehow pair these sort of these wasted resources with unemployed architects and young couples who could not afford a house, and that there was like a sort of positive and creative solution for these, where somehow, young architects paired with young clients, could get these things at a discount and find what would be the cheapest, most creative and exciting way to finish these buildings, right? And of course, we didn't have the money or the capacity to convince the government to do that, so we just ended up making these images that are basically made in Photoshop, but that were enough to enter the competition and sort of basically put forward that idea. And so you can see here one of the ruins, and then a little proposal. So it's a very, very direct project, in a way, very literal, very, very explicit. As I was saying, I'm very interested in this idea of construction, and the idea of broad spectrum architecture has to do with basically taking the things that are there already, or the things that are inevitable, and trying to put design intelligence into trying to make them into something more worthwhile for everyone. So this was a commission and built for a horseback riding shed, basically for a dressage court in rural Spain, in the center of the country, in a fairly unpopulated area. And I mean, the client wanted something really fancy, but when I visited, really everything around it is just metal sheds, right? Like tobacco drying sheds, agrarian sheds, small silos, etc. Well, why would we do something other than that? Why cannot we take, a galvanized steel shed with a metal roof and just make it into something more expressive of what the project wants to be, that had to do with the movement of the horse and this idea of music and rhythm, and why not just make the structure nicer, and then why not just work the roof into some more heroic skylights and just have that be the project, right? In a very similar vein, now in the US, already this is a project I did with some RISE students for a series of water towers in Presidio County, which is where Marfa is, so sort of West Texas. And it was a similar idea where on the one hand, there was a structural thing that we were looking into that had to do with how to try and make a moment frame with post and beam glulam. So and how to use the weight of the water to act as a sort of stabilizer as well of the. So there was an investigation that was more technical or more structural, but really the impetus was the same, which is, okay, this is a very this is an area that clearly needs these water towers for survival, increasingly so. So instead of, why don't we allocate the resources, and not just the material resources, but our own intelligence and our own creativity into making those necessary infrastructural pieces into things that could become the identity of these places, right? Like that could become culturally viable and culturally meaningful structures in this landscape that would eventually, become part of its own self-image. So we made a series of, there are there are many, and they are all different because the idea is that you would find them in the landscape, right? That this is how you move in West Texas. You're driving long distances, anyways, and you would know that you were in a new township, or you would know that you were arriving at a new locale because you would see similar but different water tower. And you can see this is just for fun, size of the models that we were making. I think making models is really one of the most rewarding parts of being an architect. And so in that line of work, the last project that I've done is this mass timber pavilion, which sits at the campus at Rice University. It's in a little pocket of land within the campus that some faculty members are advocating should become a small natural reserve and should not be developed by the university. So I had a grant through the Forest Service that related to my research on mass timber, and then I partnered with these biology professors to try and do a little observation pavilion and place it there as a way, almost like a Trojan horse, as a way to lobby the university and lobby to raise awareness of what was happening already, which is that you had these crazy biologists, plant biologists, insect biologists, bird biologists, that were trying to replant this no man's land basically into a native, back into a native landscape. And so in this case, it was a reflection on the material itself. If you are familiar with mass timber, CLT is produced in large panels that are glued and pressed into layers, and then cut. It's true that and frustrating to some degree that you can be inside a mass timber building and really not understand how it's built. I think that's part of what drives people crazy about it, like especially when it's done with this type of panel construction. So the project was like a little, almost like a little piece of poetry where we were taking the prose in the sense of the sort of raw language of how you put these things together, how you build these things, and then turning it into something more expressive. So CLT is a two-way material. It's very versatile structurally. So we wanted to make the pillars, the beams, the roof. We wanted to make everything with the same material. We wanted to preserve the simple form of the rectangular panel and just have it be. There would be a slight variation in size of the components. That there would be a rhythm to the angles of the composition, which would make it basically work together. That it would be built in a way that would require almost only wood and screw, so that basically you would be able to understand how it's being put together and how it's holding up by looking at the building at the end of the day. And it was a really beautiful process, working with students and working with a structural engineer from the beginning of the process, and I think it was fairly successful. These are the drawings that the students did for permitting and for construction documents. And in the end, the pavilion works like as an ode to this construction material. It works a little bit like an IKEA piece of furniture, in the sense that you see it and you have a sense of how it's made. It also comes in a flat pack, only it's not a box, it's a big truck, but then gets assembled with screws. So it's basically taking what's already inevitable about this way of building, which is its immediacy, and turning it into the topic of the project, right? And then also because of this larger idea about how the landscape where it sits is going to evolve in the future, we wanted to read a little bit like a ruin, like the ruin of a small temple, so that when right now, for instance, this is right after finishing construction, now it's completely overgrown, and it looks really nice in an overgrown landscape because it's already conceived to look like a ruin. So in a certain sort of indifference and something that maybe looks unfinished or in ruination. And then, of course, the reason why CLT is interesting in the first place is because it's a carbon negative construction material, right? So there's something also about this building that can look a little bit like a brutalist concrete structure, but it's actually made of solid wood, which means that we're also visually making the point that yes, this structure could be built with concrete, which would entail putting tons and tons and tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, but because it's made of wood, it's actually sequestering tons of carbon from the atmosphere. Right? So the ambiguity, when you see it from afar, is fairly ambiguous. We did a coat so that you don't read the yellow tone of the pine very directly, and then you have to get close, and that's when you really see that it's indeed made of wood. And so it's like a transfiguration of a concrete structure into a wood structure as well. And there's a which we are not the first to have done, of course. So that's a line of project that has to do with, again, this idea of we have this language that we use, which is what the nuts and bolts of architecture, how things are put together. Instead of looking for the ideas for our projects or the topics for our projects outside of that, you can just focus on that and take that language and turn it into something that is perhaps a bit more expressive and legitimize the material investment that is to make a building. Now, moving into housing, I think mass housing is really important, and I think is where architects have an easier way to make a political claim or make a political statement. In this case, this project is a competition for mass housing in the city of Munich in Germany. This project is from 2017, which was at the midst of the refugee crisis. So Munich was the fastest growing city in the whole of Europe. It was receiving refugees from the Syrian war. It was receiving a lot of immigrants, and they just couldn't work fast enough. They couldn't acquire land fast enough. So the city, the housing authorities, which produce the majority of the housing in this part of the world, the majority of the housing is public housing. They made an open call to architects saying, we built all these neighborhoods in the 60s and 70s, which are mostly sleeper towns in the periphery of the city. We still own the surfing, we still own the parking lots, we still own the little parks between the buildings. Could you come up with ideas for an urbanism, a sort of perhaps prefabricated construction buildings that could help us re-densify and cope with the demographic pressure and the sort of housing crisis? And so we were given 2 neighborhoods to analyze. This is the existing footprint, and what we proposed was basically to try and complete it. So just work with the existing typologies. The buildings there are, beautiful, but they're quite boring. They're not famous buildings. They're very banal buildings in a way, even though they're fairly well done. So if there's an L-shaped block, we would propose an L-shaped block. If there was freestanding point towers, we would add more towers. If there were linear blocks, we would add more linear blocks. And the idea was to try and basically, or our thesis was that this was an incomplete landscape, and that we could just complete it by without having to depart from the typologies and the types of buildings that existed there already. So what we were trying to do was mostly to make greater degree of difference between the landscape that you see when you're on the street and the landscape that you see when you are inside the housing state. So in its current condition, everything is floating, buildings are far from each other, and it feels a little bit like a soup. What we were trying to do is add our new buildings basically to make a stronger urban facade towards the street, so that you could have more activated, lively, commercial thoroughfares, and then have that be contrasted with the more intimate and more residential courtyards of the housing states. And this is the second neighborhood, very similar approach. I'll go fast because I know that we don't have a lot of time. And it was all, because the buildings were very different, we had to find like a building block with which we could basically build all of them. And we came up with this idea of a mass timber CLT 3D module, which then combined with a facade system and 3 different types of vertical cores allowed us to basically fulfill all of these different unit types. So in Europe, they have, or in many European countries, they have this idea that buildings should not be ghettos. Like there should not be buildings for young people, buildings for couples, buildings for old people, buildings for big families. They should all be mixed. So basically, in this case, we were asked to fulfill 9 different types of apartments, everything from a studio to a 4-bedroom, and with very strict square footage limits, etc. So this structural box, like this shoe box, was the structural way to build this in a fast and sort of economic way, but it was also, we retooled it so that it also allowed us in increments of 1 box to fulfill all of these different apartment types. And it was an interesting exploration, I think, in terms of plan, which is in between a traditional apartment plan with a corridor and one that is more like an enfilade. There was a facade, which I will not talk about. And basically with that system, we were able to produce several different types of buildings that resonated with the existing buildings on the neighborhood, but somehow changed enhanced the urban form and produced the additional amount of housing that was required. So something very important is that because the new population were mostly immigrants and refugees, it was very important that these buildings should not look like temporary buildings or like barracks, or that they should not look prefabricated. And also that that's for the new residents, but also for the existing residents, that they should not feel that their neighborhoods were being downgraded by this addition of. So that's also why we chose to work with brick and a series of materials and languages that had to do with early 20th century German architecture, very early sort of social housing. And in the end, all these buildings are jagged because we had to fulfill these different percentages of the different units, and so it was impossible to control all the parameters. So what we did is to express the structural box in the buildings, so that then no matter the numbers that you were being required to produce of the 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 4-bedroom, you would just pile them to different heights, and it would always look intentional because it was already intended to look like a little construction toy. No? And then in the inside, working with wood allowed us to basically dignify the interior of these affordable units. Right? So very tight square footage, but through basically controlling things like the size of openings and things like the sort of views through spaces, etc. We were able, I think, to create an architecture that enhanced or sort of dignified daily life, and where the title of the competition entry, which we won but did not build, was called Small Room, Big Window. And again, it was the idea. It's a very silly project. It's a structural wood box, but if you put enough thought into it, you can get a lot of return. And maybe sometimes just making a window bigger than normal is enough to make an ordinary room extraordinary. So some years later, I had a chance to design together with 2 colleagues, with Juan Alfonso Garduño and with Alfonso Jimenez and Ciso, this housing project where we were able to actually implement a lot of the ideas that we came up for the Munich project, but we were not able to build. This is an affordable housing project in the town of Tulum, in the state of Quintana Roo, in Mexico, which is growing very fast, has a similar problem of having to add units incredibly fast. And we found a sort of private-public partnership that wanted to do these affordable housing projects. And it works with a lot of the same ideas, which is, with small units, just work with the sort of massing of the buildings, the orientation of the units, the size of the openings, etc. In this case, we could also work with the vegetation. So this is very much like Houston in Tulum. If you don't work the land, it will grow a jungle almost immediately. In 5-10 years, it will look completely thick. So what we were able to do is to basically organize the buildings in a way that we could respect the existing vegetation and have each of the small units, have this big opening towards the tropical vegetation, and have this sort of high density development that is very affordable, yet where the units have this very direct relationship with the jungle, which is not how they're building there right now. You can see here a little bit this idea of it's made out of courtyards basically, with the orientation of the units mostly intended to keep privacy. And then these are some images from construction a couple of months ago. This should be inaugurated. We should do the ribbon cutting in January if everything goes well. All right. And then last project I'm gonna show is a small house in Spain, in the north of Spain, where we had an opportunity where it's already built, and I can show what some of these ideas are in the flesh, in the reality of built construction. This was a stone farm, basically. You can see existing farms of the same type dotting the landscape in the image. That we renovated for a young family to turn it into a house. These were not actual homes, so you can see here a photograph of the ruin of the existing building. It was a barn downstairs for maybe 12 cows. It wasn't tall enough for a person to stand on. It was tall enough only for the cows. And then with this little stair, you would go up to basically 3 tiny rooms at the front of the house. A kitchen, a bathroom, and a room big enough to fit a bed. And then the rest of the second story was basically just for the hay to feed the cows. So it took quite a bit of maneuvering to get a building that was not intended for humans entirely to actually feed a house. But we made a big effort to try and respect the existing building and work with some of the qualities of the local construction. This was under a very heavy protection regime, so we had to preserve the entirety of the building. We could not add to it. And so in the end, what we did is restore the stone walls and then create a very light wood construction inside, where we would basically, this is the ground floor plan, so we would put all the services on a little core element, like the band that you see on the right, which has the kitchen, stair, storage, bathroom, utility room, entrance, etc. And then leave the rest of the plan for living space. And then on top, just very simple division of the plan into 3 parts for 3 bedrooms. And the only part of the project that, where we could elaborate a little bit was when, where those 2 plans came together, and, where we could do, basically turn the staircase, the element, which is it's a skylight, it's a staircase, it also houses the storage. That becomes a slightly more complex 3-dimensional piece that we worked on. So the only meaningful change that we did to the building is we made a new structure, a new wood structure inside, of course, but the only meaningful change that we did is to make the openings bigger, because these buildings were not intended for humans. They didn't have enough natural light. And so that we had to do. Openings to the south are big, openings to the north are small, except for the skylight. And then we tried to just find the joy in working with the things that we needed to do anyways, like downspouts, the design of the windows, the design of the small retaining walls that were necessary to adapt to the slope, the reconceptualization of the traditional wood structure. So we were mandated that we had to use the traditional wood structure here, and we just did this exercise of trying to abstract it a little bit and somehow work with simple things like paint. Using paint allowed us to use much cheaper materials. So some of this is pine, some of it is plywood, some of it is MDF, some of it is oak in the windows. But we were somehow trying to see how we could work, accept the existing condition, and bring it into our own sensibility through this exercise of simplification. And I'll finish on this image where, again, basically all of this to say that sometimes I think just thinking about where you place a window, how big the window is, silly things like that can be enough to merit being called architecture. Thank you.